Chapter 13 of The Power of Israel and the United States by James Petras. Noam Chomsky and the Pro-Israel Lobby. 15 Erroneous Theses. An excerpt from the Financial Times, April 2006. Reflexes that ordinarily spring automatically to the defense of open debate and free inquiry shut down, at least among much of America's political elite, once the subject turns to Israel, and above all, the pro-Israel lobby's role in shaping U.S. foreign policy. Moral blackmail, the fear that any criticism of Israeli policy and U.S. support for it will lead to charges of anti-Semitism, is a powerful disincentive to publish dissenting views. It is also leading to the silencing of policy debate on American university campuses, partly as the result of targeted campaigns against the dissenters. Nothing, moreover, is more damaging to U.S. interests than the inability to have a proper debate about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Bullying Americans into consensus on Israeli policy is bad for Israel, and it makes it impossible for America to articulate its own national interests. Financial Times editorial, Saturday, April 1st, 2006. Introduction. Noam Chomsky has been called the leading U.S. intellectual by pundits and even some sectors of the mass media. He has a large audience throughout the world, especially in academic circles, in large part because of his vocal criticism of U.S. foreign policy and many of the injustices resulting from those policies. Chomsky has been reviled by all of the major Jewish and pro-Israel organizations and media for his criticism of Israeli policy toward the Palestinians, even as he has defended the existence of the Zionist state of Israel. Despite his respected reputation for documenting, dissecting, and exposing the hypocrisy of the U.S. and European regimes and acutely analyzing the intellectual deceptions of imperial apologists, these analytical virtues are totally absent when it comes to discussing the formulation of U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East, particularly the role of his own ethnic group, or the Jewish pro-Israel lobby and their Zionist supporters in the government. This political blindness is not unknown or uncommon. History is replete with intellectual critics of all imperialisms, except their own, staunch opponents of the abuses of power by others, but not of one's own kin and kind. Chomsky's long history of denying the power and role of the pro-Israel lobby in decisively shaping U.S. Middle East policy culminated in his recent conjoining with the U.S. Zionist propaganda machine in attacking a study critical of the Israeli lobby. I'm referring to the essay published by the London Review of Books entitled The Israel Lobby by Professor John Mearsheimer of the University of Chicago and Professor Stephen Walt, the academic dean of the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. A complete version of the study was published by the Kennedy School of Government in March 2006. Chomsky's speeches and writing on the lobby emphasize a number of dubious propositions. 1. The pro-Israel lobby is just like any other lobby. It has no special influence or place in U.S. politics. 2. The power of the groups backing the Israel lobby are no more powerful than other influential pressure groups. 3. The lobby's agenda succeeds because it coincides with the interests of the dominant powers and interests of the U.S. state. 4. The lobby's weakness is demonstrated by the fact that Israel is merely a tool of U.S. empire building to be used when needed and otherwise marginalized. 5. The major forces shaping U.S. Middle East policy are big oil and the military-industrial complex, neither of which is connected to the pro-Israel lobby. 6. The interests of the U.S. generally coincide with the interests of Israel. 7. The Iraq War, the threats to Syria and Iran are primarily a product of oil interests and the military-industrial complex, and not due to the role of the pro-Israel lobby or its collaborators in the Pentagon and other government agencies. 8. The U.S. behavior in the Middle East is similar to policies that it has pursued elsewhere in the world, and this policy precedes the lobby. While in general, Chomsky has deliberately refrained from specifically discussing the pro-Israel lobby in his speeches, interviews, and publications analyzing U.S. policy toward the Middle East, when he does, he follows the above-mentioned repertory. The problem of war and peace in the Middle East and the role of the Israel lobby is too serious to be marginalized as an afterthought. Restrictions on our right to speak freely and critically regarding Israeli and the lobby's policies severely reduces the possibilities for political action. Repression of free thought allows for the formulation and enactment of policies that are damaging to the interests of the American people, particularly where their best interests may diverge from those of their elites. It is incumbent, therefore, to specify and examine the 15 erroneous theses of the highly respected Professor Chomsky in order to move ahead and confront the lobby's threats to peace abroad and civil liberties at home. Chomsky's 15 Theses. 1. Chomsky claims that the lobby is just another lobby in Washington, yet he fails to observe that the lobby has secured the biggest congressional majorities in favor of allocating 3 times the annual foreign aid designated to all of Africa, Asia, and Latin America to Israel, over $100 billion over the last 40 years. The lobby has 150 full-time functionaries working for the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, AIPAC, accompanied by an army of lobbyists from all the major Jewish organizations, Anti-Defamation League, B'nai B'rith, American Jewish Committee, etc., and the nationwide regional and local Jewish federations, which hew closely to the line of the majors, are active in policy and local opinion on Israel, and promote and finance legislative candidates on the basis of their adherence to the lobby's party line. No other lobby combines the wealth, grassroots networks, media access, legislative muscle, and single-minded purpose of the pro-Israel lobby. 2. Chomsky fails to analyze the near-unanimous congressional majorities which yearly support all the pro-Israel military, economic, immigration privileges, and aid promoted by the lobby. He fails to examine the list of over 100 successful legislative initiatives publicized yearly by AIPAC even in years of budgetary crisis, disintegrating domestic health services, and war-induced military losses. 3. Chomsky's cliché-ridden attribution of war aims to big oil is totally unsubstantiated. In fact, the U.S. Middle East wars prejudice the oil interests in several strategic senses. The wars generate generalized hostility to oil companies with long-term relations with Arab countries. The wars result in undermining the likelihood of new contracts opening in Arab countries for U.S. oil investments. U.S. oil companies have been much friendlier to peacefully resolving conflicts than Israel, and especially its lobbyists, as any reading of the specialized oil industry journals and spokespeople emphasize. Chomsky chooses to totally ignore the pro-war activities and propaganda of the leading Jewish pro-Israel organizations and the absence of pro-war proposals in big oil's media, and their beleaguered attempt to continue linkages with Arab regimes opposed to Israel's belligerent hegemonic ambitions. Contrary to Chomsky, by going to war in the Middle East, the U.S. sacrifices the vital interests of the oil companies in favor of Israel's quest for Middle East hegemony, responding to the call and at the behest of the pro-Israel lobby. In the lobbying conquest, there is absolutely no contest between the pro-Israel power bloc and the oil companies, whether the issue is war or oil contracts. The former always predominate. But Chomsky never examines the comparative strength of the two lobbies regarding U.S. policy toward the Middle East. In general, this usually busy researcher, devoted to uncovering obscure documentation, is particularly lax when it comes to uncovering readily available documents, which shred his assertions about big oil and the Israel lobby. 4. Chomsky refuses to analyze the diplomatic disadvantages that accrue to the U.S. in vetoing Security Council resolutions condemning Israel's systematic violations of human rights. Neither the military-industrial complex nor big oil has a stranglehold on U.S. voting behavior in the UN. The pro-Israel lobbies are the only major force pressuring for the vetoes against the U.S.'s closest allies, world public opinion, and at the cost of whatever role the U.S. could play as mediator between the Arab Islamic world and Israel. The public defense of Israeli crimes has nowhere been so evident or disadvantageous to U.S. global standing as its refusal to condemn the Israeli strikes on the civilians of Lebanon. 5. Again, for one so rigorous as Chomsky, it is striking that he fails to discuss the role of the lobby in electing congresspeople, their funding of pro-Israel candidates, and the over $50 million they spend on the political parties, candidates, and propaganda campaigns. The result is a 90% congressional vote on high-priority items pushed by the lobby and affiliated local and regional pro-Israel federations. The congressional vote on a measure with genocidal consequences to cut off all aid to the Palestinians pushed by AIPAC and all the Jewish majors was approved by a vote of 361 to 37 with 9 abstentions. The Jewish pro-genocide regime overrode the tiny liberal group of Jewish opponents allied with the Catholic Church and the World Council of Churches, referred to by the Jerusalem Post as, quote, leftists. Worse, the lobby almost shuts down the political system as a tool through which the American people democratically assert their preferences on major issues. Witness the near-unanimous support of the Democratic Party for the Iraq War, and even a possible war against Iran, despite polls that now indicate that a majority of Americans desire otherwise. 6. Nor does he undertake to analyze the cases of candidates defeated by the lobby, or the abject apologies extracted from congresspeople who have dared to question the policies and tactics of the lobby, and the intimidation effect of its exemplary punishments on the rest of Congress. The snowball effect of punishment and payoffs is one reason for the unprecedented majorities in favor of all AIPAC's initiatives. Chomsky's feeble attempts to equate AIPAC's pro-Israel initiatives with broader U.S. policy interests is patently absurd to anyone who studies the alignment of policy groups associated with designing, pressuring, backing, and co-sponsoring AIPAC's measures. The reach of the Jewish lobby far exceeds its electoral constituency, as the $1 million slush fund to defeat incumbent Georgia Congresswoman Cynthia McKinney demonstrated. That she was subsequently reelected on the basis of low-keying her criticism of Israel reveals the lobby's impact even on consequential Democrats. 7. Chomsky ignores the unmatchable power of elite convocation that the lobby has. The AIPAC annual meeting draws all the major leaders in Congress, key members of the cabinet, over half of all members of Congress who pledge unconditional support for Israel and even identify Israel's interests as U.S. interests. No other lobby can secure this degree of attendance of the political elite, this degree of abject servility for so many years among both major parties. What is particularly important to bear in mind is that the Jewish electorate is less than 5% of the total electorate, while practicing Jews number less than 2% of the population, of which not all are Israel firsters. None of the major lobbies like the NRA, AARP, the National Association of Manufacturers, the National Chamber of Commerce, can convoke such a vast array of political leaders, let alone secure their unconditional support for favorable legislation and executive orders. No less an authority than the former Prime Minister of Israel, Ariel Sharon, boasted of the power of the pro-Israel lobby over U.S. Middle East policy. Chomsky merely asserts that the pro-Israel lobby is just like any other lobby, without any serious effort to compare their relative influence, power of convocation, and bipartisan support or effectiveness in securing high-priority legislation. 8. In his analysis of the run-up to the US-Iraq War, Chomsky's otherwise meticulous review of foreign policy documents, analysis of political linkages between policymakers and power centers, is totally abandoned in favor of impressionistic commentaries completely devoid of any empirical basis. The principal governmental architects of the war, the intellectual promoters of the war, their publicly enunciated, published strategies for the war were all deeply attached to the Israel lobby and worked for the Israeli state. Wolfowitz, number 2 in the Pentagon, Douglas Feith, number 3 in the Pentagon, Richard Perle, head of the Defense Policy Board, Elliot Abrams in charge of Near East and North African affairs for the National Security Council, and dozens of other key operatives in the government and ideologues in the mass media were lifelong fanatical activists in favor of Israel, some of whom had lost security clearances in previous administrations for handing over documents to the Israeli government. Chomsky ignores the key strategy documents written by Pearl, Wormser, Feith, and other Zion cons in the late 1990s demanding bellicose action against Iraq, Iran, and Syria, which they subsequently implemented when they took power with Bush's election. How can a first-rate intellectual critic of U.S. foreign policy ignore, as Chomsky totally ignores, the disinformation office set up in the Pentagon by ultra-Zionist Douglas Feith, the so-called Office of Special Plans, run by fellow Zion con Abram Shulsky to channel bogus data to the White House, bypassing and discrediting CIA and military intelligence, which contradicted their disinformation? Non-Zionist specialists in the Pentagon's Middle East office, Colonel Karen Kwiatkowski, described in great detail the easy and constant flow of Mossad and Israeli military officers in and out of Feith's office, while critical U.S. experts were virtually barred. None of the key policymakers promoting the war had any connection to the military-industrial complex or big oil, but all were deeply and actively tied to the State of Israel and backed by the lobby. Astonishingly, Chomsky, famous for his criticism of intellectuals enamored with imperial power and uncritical academics, pursues a similar path when it concerns pro-Israel intellectuals in power and their Zionist academic colleagues. The problem is not only the lobby pressuring from outside, but their counterparts within the state. 9. Chomsky frequently criticizes the half-hearted criticisms by liberals of U.S. foreign policy, yet he nowhere raises a single peep about the absolute silence of Jewish progressives about the major role of the lobby in promoting the invasion of Iraq. At no point does he engage in debate or criticism of the scores of Israel First academic supporters of war with Iraq, Iran, or Syria. Instead, his criticisms of the war revolves around the role of party leaders, the Bush administration, etc., without any attempt to understand the organized basis and ideological mentors of the militarists. 10. Chomsky fails to analyze the impact of the concerted and uninterrupted campaign organized by all major U.S. pro-Israel lobbies and personalities to silence criticism of Israel and the lobby's support for the war. Chomsky's refusal to criticize the lobby's abuse of anti-Semitism to destroy our civil liberties, hound academics out of the universities and other positions for criticizing Israel and the lobby, is most evident in the recent smear campaign of Professors Walt and Mearsheimer. When the lobby successfully pressured Harvard to disclaim Professor Walt and may have eventually forced his resignation from the deanship at the Kennedy School at Harvard, despite Walt's own disclaimer, Chomsky joined the lobby in condemning their extensive critical scholarship and meticulous analysis. At no point does Chomsky deal with the central facts of their analysis about the lobby's contemporary power over U.S. Middle East policy. The irony is Chomsky himself, an occasional victim of academic Zionist hatchet jobs, this time is on the giver's end. 11. Chomsky fails to assess the power of the lobby in comparison with other institutional forces. For example, top U.S. generals have frequently complained that Israeli armed forces receive new high-tech military hardware before it has become operational in the U.S. Thanks to the lobby, their complaints are rarely heeded. U.S. defense industries have bitterly complained of Israel's unfair competition, violation of trade agreements, and the illegal sale of high-tech weaponry to China. Under threat from the Pentagon of losing all their lucrative ties, Israel canceled sales to China, while the lobby looked on. During the run-up to the U.S. invasion of Iraq, many active and retired military officials and CIA analysts opposed the war and questioned the assumptions and projections of the pro-Israeli ideologues in the Pentagon. They were overruled, their advice dismissed by the Zion cons, and belittled by their ideological backers writing in the major print media. The Zion cons and the government successfully overcame their institutional critics in large part because their opinion and policies toward the war were uncritically accepted by the mass media, and particularly by the New York Times, whose primary war protagonist, Judith Miller, had close links with the lobby. These are well-known historical linkages and debates of which a close reader of the mass media like Chomsky would have been aware. But Chomsky deliberately chose to omit and deny these, substituting more selective criticism of the Iraq War based on the exclusion of vital facts. 12. What passes for Chomsky's refutation of the power of the lobby is a superficial historical review of U.S.-Israel relations, citing the occasional conflict of interests in which, even more occasionally, the pro-Israel lobby failed to get its way. Chomsky's historical arguments resemble a lawyer's brief more than a comprehensive review of the power of the lobby. For example, while indeed in 1956 the U.S. objected to the joint French-British-Israeli attack on Egypt, does this mitigate the fact that over the next 50 years, the U.S. financed and supplied the Israeli war machine to the tune of $70 billion, thanks largely to the pressure of the lobby? In fact, in 1967, the Israeli Air Force bombed the U.S. intelligence gathering ship, the USS Liberty, in international waters and strafed U.S. naval personnel, killing or wounding over 200 sailors and officers. The Johnson administration, in a historically unprecedented move, refused to retaliate and silenced the survivors of the unprovoked attack with threats of court-martial. No subsequent administration has ever raised the issue, let alone conducted an official congressional investigation, even as they escalated aid to Israel and prepared to use nuclear weapons to defend Israel when it seemed to be losing the Yom Kippur War in 1972. The U.S. defense of Israel led to the very costly Arab oil boycott, which brought on a massive increase in the price of oil and the animosity of former Arab allies, threatening global monetary stability. In other words, in this, as in many other cases, the pro-Israel lobby was more influential than the U.S. armed forces in shaping U.S. response to an Israeli act of aggression against American servicemen operating in international waters. In recent years, the power of the lobby has seriously inhibited the FBI's prosecution of the scores of Israeli spies who entered the U.S. in 2001. The most that was done was their quiet deportation. The recent arrests of 2 AIPAC officials for handing confidential government documents over to Israeli embassy officials has led the pro-Israel lobby to mobilize a mass media campaign in their defense, converting an act of espionage against the U.S. into an, quote, exercise of free speech. Editorials and op-ed articles in favor of dismissal of the charges have appeared in most of the leading newspapers in what must be the most unprecedented campaign in favor of agents of a foreign government in U.S. history. The power of the propaganda reach of the lobby far exceeds any countervailing power, even though the case against the AIPAC officials is very strong and includes the testimony of the key Pentagon official convicted of handing them the documents. 13. Chomsky, a highly reputable critic of the bias of the mass media, attributes corporate ties to their anti-worker news reports. However, when it comes to the overwhelming pro-Israel bias, he has never analyzed the influence of the Israel lobby, the link between the pro-Israel media elite and the pro-Israel bias, merely a blind spot or a case of ideologically driven intellectual amnesia. 14. Chomsky cites Israel's importance for U.S. imperial strategy in weakening Arab nationalism, its role in providing military aid and military advisors to totalitarian terrorist regimes when the U.S. Congress imposes restrictions to direct U.S. involvement. There is little doubt that Israel serves U.S. imperial purposes, especially in situations where bloody politics are involved. But this ignores the corollary that Israel benefited from doing so, and perhaps did so for this very reason. It increased military revenues, gained backers favoring Israel's colonial policies, provided markets for Israeli arms dealers, and in general established the appearance of a quid pro quo in what would otherwise demonstrably be a ludicrously one-sided relationship. However, a more comprehensive analysis of U.S. interests demonstrates that the costs of supporting Israel far exceed the occasional benefit, whether we consider advantages to U.S. imperial goals or even more so from the vantage point of a democratic foreign policy. With regard to the costly and destructive wars against Iraq, following Israel's lead and its lobbies, the pro-Israel policy has severely undermined U.S. military capacity to defend the empire elsewhere, has led to a loss of its prestige and perception of its power, and discredited U.S. claims to be a champion of freedom and democracy. From the viewpoint of democratic foreign policy, it has strengthened the militarist wing of the government and undermined democratic freedoms at home. Israel benefits, of course, because the war destroyed a major secular adversary and allowed it to tighten its stranglehold on the occupied territories. Leftist apologists for what Israelis call the U.S. Jewish lobby, like Noam Chomsky and Steve Zunes, argue that U.S. behavior in the Middle East is similar to policies that it has pursued elsewhere in the world, and this general policy is said to precede the lobby. This argument goes against most of U.S. post-World War II history. Voluminous evidence demonstrates that the U.S. opposed colonialism and communism in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, seeking to replace European and Japanese colonial regimes to open markets and investment opportunities for U.S. multinational corporations. Israel is the only colonial power opposing non-communist movements that the U.S. has supported. For example, during the Suez Crisis of 1956, when Britain, France, and Israel invaded and occupied the Egyptian Suez and Sinai, the U.S. opposed their effort to restore colonial rule. Subsequently, by the late 1960s, as the Jewish lobby increased its power in the U.S., supported with arms, billions of dollars, and diplomacy, Israeli colonization, territorial land grabs, and air assaults throughout the Middle East, a policy which did not and does not, which it does not support in any other place in the world, particularly colonial state attacks aimed against some countries which have ties to U.S. oil companies. Unlike most of the rest of Asia, Latin America, and Africa, where the U.S. has developed close ties with elected neoliberal regimes, the U.S. cannot replicate this policy in the Middle East because electoral processes result in negative outcomes, in part because of the U.S. ties to the Israeli colonial state and its policy of territorial conquest. The major premise of U.S. imperial foreign policy is to extract huge profits from Africa, Latin America, and Asia, which is routinely accomplished, except in relation to Israel, which extracts from $3 to $10 billion of tribute each and every year. This is so evident as to be ridiculous. In an interview with the Wall Street Journal, April 12, 2006, Israeli Prime Minister Olmert announced he would seek $10 billion to relocate 70,000 Jewish colonists in the West Bank. The Jewish lobby immediately lined up scores of congresspeople to support the outrageous Israeli proposal at a time when hundreds of thousands of Hurricane Katrina victims are without any housing, employment, or future. Never has the U.S. engaged in an imperial war in which its major economic interests have either opposed that war or remained silent. If we examine the cases cited by Chomsky and his acolytes, Guatemala 1954, Iran 1954, and Chile 1973, the major economic groups supported U.S. intervention: United Fruit in Guatemala, Standard Oil in Iran, Anaconda, and ITT in Chile. In the current Middle East and South Asian wars, there is no comparable influence by major economic, oil associations, or even individual enterprises. Chomsky has not cited a single public statement or confidential memo or oil industry lobby which is pushing the war agenda. In contrast, there are over 2,000 statements, press releases, conferences, interviews, op-ed articles, documents by all the major Jewish lobbies and their leaders which promoted the Iraq invasion and presently promote a preemptive attack on Iran. No other foreign policy area in the recent history of the United States has been subject to such a long-term, large-scale propaganda effort by a lobby acting on behalf of a foreign power, as is the case of the Jewish lobby on behalf of Israel. The analogies with the old China lobby are laughable, both in terms of scope and influence in Congress. Likewise, the anti-Castro lobby has failed to block $1 billion USD and US exports to Cuba, backed by a formidable array of business interests. Moreover, the anti-Cuban lobby does not pursue the state policies of a foreign government and lacks the financing, media influence, and organization of the pro-Israel Jewish lobby. Except in the Caribbean and Central America, the U.S. has not invaded or gone to war to overthrow a regime in Latin America, unlike the case in the Middle East. The U.S. utilizes domestic surrogates, military officials in alliance with local ruling classes, to depose nationalist or democratic regimes. In the case of Iraq, however, the U.S. has engaged in a direct military invasion, and it plans future air and land wars against Iran and Syria. The different strategies reflect different policies designed by policymakers with conflicting priorities in U.S. empire building. The neocons seek to destroy Israeli adversaries, even if it means prejudicing U.S. economic interests, while the neocolonialists seek to conquer resources, not territories. U.S. foreign policy frequently involves debates, discussions, alternatives, even within the framework of empire building. There is no such debate on the Middle East, which involves policy related to Israel. The lobby mobilizes between 90 to 98% of Congress members. U.S. behavior in the United Nations on human rights resolutions, sanctions, and peace proposals affecting Israeli colonial policy is profoundly influenced by the lobby. On no other foreign policy issue has the U.S. used its veto to protect a consistent violator of international law as it has with Israel. Except for the resounding UN opposition to the U.S. economic blockade of Cuba, only the U.S. policy condoning Israeli colonial expansion and violent intervention in Palestine has evoked such worldwide opposition. To conflate U.S. imperial policies, policymakers, and relations with Israel as similar to its configuration related to the rest of the world is historically false, empirically without foundation, and lacking in any analytical sophistication. No other regional foreign policy had so many key policymakers in the State Department and Pentagon organically linked and politically loyal to a foreign state, as is the case in the contemporary Middle East. No other foreign policy area has been so uncontested in the mass media as is the Israeli colonial expansion and its sustained violation of human rights. U.S. Middle East experts who are not unconditional supporters of Israel are labeled by the lobby as Arabists, or worse, anti-Semites, and have been totally marginalized in the State Department, the military, and the CIA, or driven from congressional office. No other regional policy area has this occurred. To argue that U.S. Middle East policy is the same imperial policy applied elsewhere is to ignore the different alignments and power groups involved in determining policy, and more importantly, the uses to which imperial power is applied and for what interests. The unconditional commitment to the Israeli colonial state has eroded U.S. relations with the richest and most populous states in the Arab and Islamic world. In market terms, the difference is between hundreds of billions of dollars in sales versus defending a receiver of massive U.S. aid handouts. The economic losses far outweigh any small-scale questionable military benefits. The Arab states are net buyers of U.S. military hardware. The Israeli arms industry is a stiff competitor. U.S. oil and gas companies are net losers in terms of investments, profits, and markets because of the U.S. ties to Israel, which, because of its small market, has little to offer in each of the above categories. Big Oil was indeed interested in investing in Saddam's Iraq. It was excluded by U.S. policy banning U.S. corporations from entering that market. The ban was part of the Zion Con strategy dating back to the Clinton presidency, itself heavily influenced by the pro-Israel lobby and Middle East policymakers, Holbrooke, Albright, Ross, Indyk, Sandy Berger, etc. That France, China, Russia, Japan, and several other countries had an interest in Iraq oil and have signed several billion-dollar oil contracts with Iran is not the cause of U.S. war policy, but the consequence of it. Certainly, big U.S. oil companies could compete and have a better than even chance of competing successfully for exploration contracts under normal market conditions if the U.S. war policy did not prohibit them. The role of the Zion cons in power diminishing the U.S. MNC presence in the Iranian oil fields demonstrates the supremacy of the Jewish lobby over big oil. Finally, the lobby's effective campaign to secure U.S. vetoes against international resolutions condemning Israel's ethnic cleansing of Palestinians and its assault on Lebanon puts the U.S. publicly and very visibly on the side of widespread legalized torture, legalized extrajudicial executions, and massive illegal population displacement, i.e. war crimes and crimes against humanity. The end result is the weakening of international law and increased volatility in an area of great strategic importance. Chomsky takes no account of the geostrategic and energy costs, the losses in our domestic freedoms resulting directly from the Middle East wars for Israel, and even less of the rise of a virulent form of Zionist neo-McCarthyism spreading throughout our academic, artistic, and other public and private institutions. If anything demonstrates the Zionists' growing power and authoritarian reach, the brutal and successful campaign against Professors Mearsheimer and Walt confirm it in spades. Conclusion. In normal times, one would give little attention to academic polemics unless they have important political consequences. In this case, however, Noam Chomsky is an icon of what stands for the U.S. anti-war movements and intellectual dissent. That he has chosen to absolve the pro-Israel lobby and its affiliated groups and media auxiliaries is an important political event, especially when questions of war and peace hang in the balance and when the majority of Americans oppose the war. Giving a free ride to the principal authors, architects, and lobbyists in favor of the war is a positive obstacle to achieving clarity about whom we are fighting and why. To ignore the pro-Israel lobby is to allow it a free hand in pushing for the invasion of Iran and Syria. Worse, to distract from its responsibility by pointing to bogus enemies is to weaken our understanding not only of the war, but also of the enemies of freedom in this country. Most of all, it allows a foreign government a privileged position in dictating our Middle East policy while proposing police state methods and legislation to inhibit debate and dissent. Let me conclude by saying that the peace and justice movements at home and abroad are bigger than any individual or intellectual, no matter what their past credentials. Yesterday, the major Zionist organizations told us whom we may or may not criticize in the Middle East. Today, they tell us whom we may criticize in the United States. Tomorrow, they will tell us to bend our heads and submit to their lies and deceptions in order to engage in new wars of conquest at the service of a morally repugnant colonial regime.